Okay. Okay, we're live now. So, hi everyone. My name's Aluk, Fontaine, Richardson. I'm usually joined by my colleagues if you guys have been watching the other podcast, but they had other professional commitments today and unfortunately couldn't make it. So, I'm a member of Realize Radicalization, a student-led organization that aims to educate the public on radicalization and extremism. On today's episode of Get Real, our podcast/webinar series, where we interview a variety of experts in the field of radicalization and extremism, we are joined by Mauro Lubrano. He is a PhD candidate in international relations at the University of St.Andrews. He also tutors there, so his current research is centered around understanding terrorist innovation processes and the impact of emerging technologies. He received his MA in Non-Proliferation and Terrorism Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, where he focused on CBRN, terrorism, jihadism, and mass mobilization. So he received his MA in Peace and Conflict Research from the University of Frankfurt am Main, and his BA in International Relations from the University of Perugia. So he's currently an analyst at Foreign Affairs, and he's previously worked as an analyst at Global Risk Insights. He was also research assistant at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. He was an intern at the Middle East Forum, as well as START. And finally, he was an intern and later research assistant at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt. So I'm super grateful, sorry for the very long intro, but I'm super grateful that he's graciously taken the time to appear on our series, because I know he's super busy. And I can't wait to get started with our discussion. So kind of to begin everything, how did you first become interested in these kind of topics, especially in regards to innovation and emerging technologies within terrorism?
Yes, I mean, first of all, let me thank you very much for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. So in general, one of the main reasons why I got interested in terrorism, even before 9/11, terrorism was a common word in Italy. More so, especially in the 70s and 80s, but even in the 90s when I was growing up in Italy, it wasn't uncommon to hear about terrorism. And now I remember especially one case in particular when a judge was killed in 1999, and that was, I think, the first time that I remember hearing the word terrorism. And it was about this group called New Red Brigades that again killed this judge. And I got quite interested, even though I was very young, because if they were called New Red Brigades, it meant that there were some older brigades out there. So that was quite interesting. But in general, so I started working on these issues, and the issue of innovation is something that I started working on when I was research assistant at CRRIC, as you've just mentioned. And I was working on emerging technologies there, and I was quite interested in looking at how terrorist groups evolve and change over time, because we have terrorist groups that have been around for decades, and in order to survive that long, they have to change, they have to adapt, they have to innovate. And I got quite interested in understanding how these processes works, especially because we're talking about clandestine groups that operate, in very environments that are subjected to, extreme conditions. And it's not like these processes happen, are not transparent, of course. They're like, again, underground clandestine organizations subjected to, various sorts of, phenomenon like, groupthink or like, and other restrictions, if you want, limitations. So, and the issue of emerging technologies is also something that I find quite interesting, because it is most certainly one of the most concerning developments that we see in this field. But at the same time, I think that there is too much focus on what emerging technologies will enable terrorist organizations to do, and we don't really look at what emerging technologies might prompt as in unintended consequences, not in terms of terrorist organizations using these technologies, but more about like how terrorist organizations might innovate ideologically, to develop forms of antagonism towards these technologies, and to the extent that they might decide to attack both the technologies and the individuals / companies that represent these technologies, which is something that I've discussed in my latest paper, which was published last month in Terrorism and Political Violence. And this paper talks about what I call the Antitechnology movement. Yeah, so I would say there was not really a short answer to say why and how I become interested in these topics, but yeah.
That's super interesting. I mean, we've chatted before. I mean, I was really interested in kind of hearing about the Red Brigades. That's super interesting to me. But kind of to pivot a little bit and go on, you touched on it a little bit, but like you kind of talked about there's like very little like literature surrounding terrorist innovation, because I mean, I didn't even hear about that kind of entire concept until I was kind of introduced to like the work you're doing. So if you wanted like to kind of sum it up, like what is the concept of terrorist innovation? Is it just related to technology, or what kind of innovations are there?
Yes, absolutely. So I would say one of the main reasons why there is literature surrounding the terrorist innovation is also because lots of authors in the past didn't really think the terrorists were innovative. They thought they were quite conservative, mostly reactive rather than proactive, and so on. But then this is, I'm also glad to say that this is changing, and we see like now a proliferation of studies that deal with the concept of innovation. Now they come from different angles and to take different approaches and different categorization of innovation. But the way that I describe the concept of terrorist innovation starts with the assumption that we have to distinguish between innovation and certain other phenomena that, while related to innovation, they not necessarily share the same characteristics. And I'm referring here to phenomena such as adaptation, improvisation, or emulation. Now, all of these phenomena can, in a way, as I said, share certain characteristics with innovation, and can also lead to innovation. They can start the process of innovation, but they also but innovation also bears specific characteristics that these other phenomena don't have. Now, to make long story short, I define innovation as a process whereby a terrorist organization will substantially rewrite certain specific pre-existing codes and norms. Whether these codes and norms are written or unwritten doesn't really matter, but basically this process of innovation will rewrite or reformulate this written or unwritten codes and norms that define substantial aspects of their behavioral patterns. So innovation is a process that it leads to long-lasting and often permanent variations in the behavioral patterns of a terrorist organization, whereby whereas, for example, improvisation is probably only related to a specific context or specific instance, whereas change can also be just a minimal change instead of a substantial change, whereas learning can also lead to not lead to change, but actually to consolidate pre-existing notions and modus operandi. And I also distinguish between three levels of innovation. I actually do not consider technological innovation to be a category, even though some people do. And the reason why I don't do so is because I think that technology is always used according to some tactical requirements or strategic thinking or operational need. So I think it's more important to focus on the reason why a specific technology is adopted or not, or developed or not, rather than looking at simply looking at the technology in question. Now, the three levels of innovation that I distinguish are the tactical, the operational, and the strategic one. Tactical innovation is probably the most frequent and pertains to aspects such as weapons adoption, weapon selection, the time and location of the attacks, the composition of a hit squad, and things like this. Operational innovation refers to those innovation that happen in the areas that affect those pursuits that are meant to keep an operation operative. So this means recruiting, propaganda, financing, and so on. Also, it refers to organizational innovation. So maybe an organization changes structure, introduces new institutions within the structure, and so on. Maybe the decision-making process changes, and so on. Lastly, strategic innovation, which is actually the main level of innovation that I focus on, at least in my work, it refers to how an organization changes goal over time and how they change the way that they intend to achieve these objectives. So I say that in strategic innovation is about introducing a game changer in the competition. It's about breaking the rules of the competition and rewriting them. Now, to make this less abstract, you can think about we can think about a few examples of strategic innovation, and I could, for example, mention the transition from the long war to the Armalite on the ballot box in the IRA, or the transition from the armed propaganda to the attack on the heart of the state in the Red Brigades, or the launch of the global jihad by Al Qaeda in the early 90s. All of these examples, represent cases of groups that were basically changing the rules of the game and introducing major new elements in the competition that were going to, again, fundamentally alter the nature of the conflict that they were engaged with against authorities or against whoever the enemy was. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because, as you kind of mentioned a little bit, I mean, people have this idea kind of that terrorists, especially because of, I guess, their maybe orthodox belief systems, that they're kind of like this stagnant kind of thing, right? But as you've said, I mean, they're keeping with the times just as everyone else is, right? So kind of on that kind of topic, we've seen kind of 3D printing technology. We've seen the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear, which is CBRN, it's kind of a mouthful technology, and UAVs. Those are kind of emerged, and we've seen militaries use them. Are you concerned with perhaps terrorists using them, or do you think the tried and true methods, if there is any, for terrorist organizations will continue to be prevalent?
Yes, absolutely. I think there are clear implications for terrorist innovation here and for terrorism in general. And we have already seen terrorist research into these new technologies in a few occasions. The 2019 Halle synagogue shooting was carried out with a weapon that had certain components that were allegedly printed with a 3D printer. So, and also we've seen attacks with unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, in many different contexts. I'm actually generally surprised that we haven't seen more of those in urban contexts. We've mostly seen terrorist research into drones in war zones or active combat areas. I mean, the main point here is that most of these technologies will make it much easier for a single person to achieve a level of destruction and disruption that is unprecedented for a single individual. What it took organizations months, if not years, substantial financing and lots of efforts to achieve can now or very soon be achieved by one or few individuals with these new technologies, most of which are also, and this is important to emphasize, are dual use, meaning that they don't only have a military purpose. They also have, like, you know, like they also have a non-military one, which means they're quite easy, or they will be soon, quite easy to obtain. It's quite easy to buy a drone, and if you know how to, you know, tinker with the drone, then you can weaponize it. You can modify it to carry some explosive, or to do other things. And if you can combine this then with, you know, facial recognition technology or other technologies, then you can really get your hands on something that can bring about considerable level of disruption or destruction. So if on the one hand I'm concerned about these developments, and also just to mention just something that I just remember last week, I think it was last week, there were news about an alleged first attack ever carried out by autonomous drones in Libya, I think it was. I'm not sure. I need to double check. But the point is that it was allegedly the first time the drones engaged a target without a specific order, because, you know, they were autonomously carrying out a mission, and then they decided to engage the target. So these are all concerning developments, and we will hear more, unfortunately, we'll hear more cases like this. But at the same time, we sort of have a dual trend. So if we see terrorist organizations experimenting with these new technologies, and the more they experiment, the better they become, obviously. Also, the more they experiment, the better we become at preventing this at the same time. So if on the one hand we see terrorists doing things, on the other hand, we see terrorists also resorting, you know, to, as you've mentioned, the tried and true methods. And actually, if you surveyed the attacks of the last years, at least in Europe, I'm referring mostly to the European context there, you will see lots of attacks were actually carried out with, like, quite rudimentary, like, means, or at least you know, with methods and techniques that we've seen before. So I'm referring to, you know, edged weapon attacks, or vehicle ramming attacks, or, you know, good old fashioned explosives. And so again, there is the sort of dual trend here. And then, as I argue in my latest paper, actually, there's also the trend that, you know, that of terrorist organizations resorting both to advanced and rudimentary technologies to attack the very emerging technologies that could at the same time enhance the capabilities of other terrorist organizations. So we're talking about, when we talk about terrorist organizations, of course, we're talking about a complex group of entities that have radically different opinion on pretty much everything. So it's also hard to just generalize and provide an answer that is applicable to the entire universe of terrorist organizations out there, because on the one hand, you might have terrorist organizations that is really excited and fascinated by new technology. On the other hand, you might have terrorist organizations that think that emerging technologies are one of the biggest threats ever, and they will resolve to eradicate these technologies. So there are these dual main trends that I've mentioned here, but there are also plenty of idiosyncratic or individual or very specific situations, conditions, approaches, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually hear about the attack last week, but I personally find it concerning. I mean, you can get like drones and those kind of things like so easily, and if you have the resources, you can also get like a 3D printer at home, right? So I mean, like if the everyday person like myself can get it, I mean, obviously terrorists can also have access, which is concerning, obviously. But kind of a little bit asking about something that you wrote about in your paper. I realized that it was just a way to like kind of categorize it, but can you like describe what are the type of things that are driving innovation among terrorists?
Yes, so I make this distinction in one of my papers between exogenous, endogenous, and mixed drivers. Now, again, this is more like for analytical purpose. I think there is no, at least I don't believe there is any single greatest cause for innovation, single greatest driver of innovation. It's always a combination of many different things. and also the context is so important. So virtually every instance of innovation is determined influence by specific conditions that you probably won't find in another instance of innovation, even within the same group, because the context and the dynamic of the conflicts are always changing. So I think it's very important to take a case-by-case approach when looking at innovation. But in general, so I distinguish between these three categories of drivers. And just to give an example of what I'm talking about here, when we talk about exogenous drivers, a quintessential exogenous drivers could be the state's countermeasures. Whatever the state, the states, not necessarily the states, countermeasures in general. So what countermeasures will be put in place to combat the specific organizations might prompt, an innovation, might lead to an innovation just because that terrorist organization has to solve a specific problem. Now you can think, for example, about the restructuring of the IRA in the second half of the 70s as an example of an instance of innovation that was influenced among other factors also by countermeasures, since they were experiencing lots of losses, at the end of the British and the loyalist groups. When it comes to endogenous drivers, we can think, for example, about the organizational dynamics. And now again, every group is their own dynamics. I know some groups might have a very charismatic leader that is very involved in the innovation process and basically determines the innovation process. You might have good leaders organizations where inside organizations there's actually a tension between different personalities, different factions. This tension can lead to splits, can lead to internal feuds, and so on. You might also have situations where you basically de facto don't have a leadership, which is what we refer to as leaderless resistance movements. So you might have groups that have actually specific institutions within the organizations that are specifically meant to deal with the innovation process, and you add that for example with Hezbollah, and so on. So also the demographic of the organization is important in this regard. But so again, as endogenous, I mean something that originates from within the organizations. And then the mixed drivers, for example, an example of mixed drivers can be the relationship that a group entertains with other terrorist organizations or non-terrorist organizations, but also with other groups that are that resort to political violence, that are also active in their area or beyond their area. Now you can think again about the IRA and how sometimes their modus operandi was influenced by what other Republican groups were doing or what the loyalist groups were doing. Similarly, in the years of lead in Italy, like when the brigades were monopolizing the extra parliamentary left-wing group, this had clear consequences on other groups within the far left milieu. And some groups were forced to take certain decisions because of what the brigades were doing. So in a way, when we talk about mixed drivers, and here with the example of the relationship with other groups, we're talking about drivers that might originate from within the group, but also from the outside. But then the overall nature of the driver is constantly shaped by what's happening outside of the organization, what's happening inside the organization. But then again, I want to emphasize once again that I don't think any of the drivers that I have identified in the paper can be considered the driver of innovation, the single greatest catalyst of innovation. Now you might have instances where one of the drivers is more plays a more prominent role, but it doesn't mean that we can infer that is just the greatest cause for innovation. And this categorization is, yes, for analytical purpose and to make our lives easier in a way.
Yeah, no, I think that's important to like say that, like, you know, everything has to be like a case by case basis, right? I mean, you can't, it would be so easy if we said pinpoint this and we said, oh, this is going to be what's driving innovation. But obviously that doesn't work like that. We had a question from the audience, actually.
Oh,
and I'm not entirely sure if you could answer it, but somebody asked, would you kindly shed light on dark cloud and terrorism? I'm not exactly sure if you could answer it.
Well, I'm not entirely sure I can, and I'm sorry. This is really not my area.
No, that's okay. Okay, I'm going to just like save that, and then hopefully I can message the person who did it and kind of figure out if we can answer that. But I appreciate everyone engaging and asking questions.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay, so next, I just want to ask, like, you know, you don't have to. I'm not sure if you'll know this or not, but like, do you see something like the COVID-19 pandemic affecting the innovation of terrorist groups throughout the globe? Because I mean, obviously we've seen such a paradigm shift in the way that governments even approach the way they treat their citizens, and then, you know, vice versa, like the way that, you know, a lot of citizens are viewing their government has completely changed. I mean, do you see that affecting terrorists in the way they innovate?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we can easily say that COVID-19 pandemic is one of, you know, the greatest, you know, and most catastrophic global events of the last decades, if not centuries. So obviously, you know, things that have this magnitude usually have an impact on everyone's life, and will impact the you know, the way that terrorist organization work as well. I mean, there were other like big, considerable, you know, events in the past that had a similar impact. Just to name a few, you know, in the 1973 Yom Kippur War actually had an impact on what lots of left-wing groups were doing in Europe. There are specific publications, documents that were published by the Red Brigades in the 70s, where they discussed the consequences of the Yom Kippur War on the global economy, and they basically interpret the Yom Kippur War as a sign that the capitalism was collapsing, and so they interpret this as a sign that they had to, in a way, upgrade their commitment to political violence and launch, you know, a new attack. And this is one of the many things that convinced them to eventually launch the attack on the heart of the state 1 year later. So this is just to say that, to emphasize that this sort of events obviously will have impact on the strategic thinking, but also in general on the modus operandi of groups. And one of the greatest impact that I've seen so far in terms of, you know, what COVID-19 as the repercussions of COVID-19 on terrorist organizations is on what I've discussed in my paper, the Antitechnology movement. Now, there are different narratives there, different interpretations, but in general, the anarchist movements that I analyze in the paper looks at this, looks at COVID-19 as an opportunity that the ruling elites are using to tighten their control over the masses, and they see all of the technologies that are being used to implement restrictions and measures to contain the pandemic. They see them as instances of instances of as a process that will lead to a new totalitarianism, a prison society, and basically what it's convincing them that the process that this process is accelerating, and that they have to upgrade their commitment to political violence. There are some publications even before the pandemic where they were already discussing this, and now you can clearly see when they discuss the consequences of the pandemic, they clearly argue that they need to upgrade. And then in other ways also, radical environmentalist groups share a similar belief now, based on completely different narratives with different goals, but they also do believe that this pandemic is showing them that the ecological collapse is imminent, and that they also have to take advantage of the flaws and fractures that they see appearing, on the techno-industrial societies. And so that they need to, again, upgrade their commitment. And I'm sure that a similar argument could be made about many other organizations. But then, as I said a few minutes ago, this sort of the consequences that this will have are surely will surely be different depending on the context and organization that we analyze. So I guess my answer is I can talk about those two cases that I've just mentioned, but in general, I think they will have consequences pretty much virtually on every single organization. But then you will really have to take a case-by-case approach and look at what the specific organization and assess the impacts that will have. But most definitely will have an impact on innovation, yes.
Yeah, I think definitely. I mean, it is concerning as well that although, you've mentioned there's obviously extremists who kind of like said, oh, the pandemic, it fed into their narrative already of, being anti-authority, basically. But I mean, it's concerning that kind of like rhetoric has bled into kind of like mainstream discourse, because like I've heard everyday people kind of like less, intense version, but they've talked about that.
You froze for a second, so I don't know.
Anti-authority thing. People are talking about. I've seen regular. Oh, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Your internet.
Okay, can you hear me?
I think.
Can you hear me?
I don't know. Hope it's not. I was blabbering on anyway. But yeah.
Can you hear me?
Am I fine now?
Can you hear me? I can sort of hear you, but like you keep freezing.
Pressing again because I don't know what's wrong.
Okay, great.
Oh, that's better. Okay,
yeah,
I can see you clearly.
Okay.
Okay, good, perfect. Anyways, what I was trying to say
about the anti-technology movement, I'm sure that they will hate this sort of disruption.
I know they're gonna say this is exactly why we're against it, because of StreamYards and Zoom. Honestly,
I hope we're not contributing to their recruitment.
I know. I'm starting to become indoctrinated by it, honestly, at this point. So while we're on the topic, anyways,
yes.
Well, quickly, what I was trying to say was basically is that people, even regular people, are becoming, I would say, even more driven towards anti-authority because of lockdown measures and these kind of things, which, had to be implemented, but people still think it's infringing upon their freedoms, a sign of totalitarianism and stuff like that. But, it's definitely concerning where we're kind of trending right now. But while we're on the topic, as we mentioned, and as that little technological mishap kind of happened, what exactly is the anti-technology movement that you've been talking about?
Yes.
What does it entail?
So the anti-technology movement is the movement of groups, entities, individuals that aim at eradicating technologies. So the difference, the fundamental difference here between groups that want to destroy technology and groups that want to eradicate technology is that the former, the groups that want to destroy technology, might do so for a variety of different reasons. I mean, a group might want to destroy technology because of the disruption or destruction that this brings about. Think, for example, about a group attacking a chemical plant to release large quantities of toxic material in the environment. Also, a group might want to attack technologies in order to use the same technologies as a weapon system. Think, for example, about the car bomb, or using aircraft, civilian aircraft, as basically as rockets. For example, on 9/11. On the other hand, groups that want to eradicate technologies basically attack the technologies because they believe the technologies represent and embody, arguably, the greatest source of the problem, the problems that we experience. Now, I identify two main souls between this anti-technology movement, which is the insurrectionary anarchist milieu and the radical environmentalist milieu. Now, let me say again that these distinctions are useful, but then they should not be. We should not approach them in a dogmatic way. The anti-technology movement, as these two souls, but they represent like two, rather than two compartmentalized souls, they represent like two ends of a spectrum, so they can overlap. That you might have, similar narratives within both groups, but then also all the characteristics that distinguish them, and so on. But in general, the insurrection anarchist milieu believes that technologies, as I have already sort of mentioned before, are contributing to the establishment of what they call a prison society and the new totalitarianism of the machines. So basically, they are arguing that the new technologies, emerging technologies, mostly, if not only, benefit the ruling elites, and they will contribute to the permanent enslavement of the masses. So they basically, in attacking these technologies, they want to fight for against oppression, and they also have an environmentalist agenda. But the main driver, if we can call it this way, is to fight against the man over man domination, and they have. It's something that has emerged in their agenda in the last 10 years, I would argue, but now you see many factions within the insurrectionary anarchist milieu embracing this agenda and promoting the war on technologies, if you want. And the main group that represents this milieu is the Informal Anarchist Federation, which is a network of insurrectionary anarchist cells that was established in Italy in 2003, and then it grew and basically formed sort of an alliance with the Greek network called Conspiracy of the Fire Nuclei, and they basically launched in 2011 this project called International Revolutionary Front. So basically, that turned the FAI into an umbrella, into a international brand. Basically, now you have anarchist cells carrying out attacks using the signature of the FAI in at least more than 16 countries, and countries from South America to Indonesia to the UK to the Netherlands and so on. And so basically, the fundamental idea is that every single technology, every single example of technology, represents power relationship, reiterates and creates a power relationship between people. So even though they could accept some form of rudimentary technology, provided that this doesn't lead to a power relationship between individuals, in general, they believe that they have to eradicate technology in order to free people from the oppression of the elites. Now, as I mentioned, they do have an environmentalist agenda as well, but it's not that predominant. As the name of the other main component of the anti-technology movement suggests, the environmental agenda is quite crucial for the radical environmentalist milieu. here again, there are many different positions within the radical environmentalist milieu, many different groups, factions, positions and approaches and so on. But basically what they believe is that that technology allow a separation between the world of man and nature, and this separation leads to man dominating nature, which eventually will lead to an environmentalist collapse, to an environmental collapse. And the most peculiar group in this milieu is probably the Mexican network that call themselves Individually Standing Towards the Wild, which is arguably the coolest name for a terrorist organization ever. But basically, they're very atypical for the radical environmentalist milieu, because instead of like sabotaging different activities that are related to technologies, they immediately started resorting to lethal operations. One of the first operations was when they murdered a Mexican researcher in Monterrey in 2011, I think, or 2012. I don't remember now. But the point there with them is that they again believe that technologies are allowing and are bringing about an environmentalist collapse. But what is interesting about them, except the fact that they are quite violent, is that they believe they're quite nihilist, and they're quite they believe that they have no chance of winning this war that they're waging against the techno-industrial society. They know they will be defeated. They know that there is no chance of victory, yet they keep fighting. And they don't keep fighting for some, noble reason or similar. The main reason why they keep fighting is because they believe they are part and parcel of nature. And so they believe that their violence is mostly motivated and determined by what they would call an instinct of vengeance and defense. So being part of nature, they believe that it's up to them to avenge nature, basically. And this is also how they justify the fact that they're quite indiscriminate in the way that they carry out violence. They argue that nature does not stop in front of everything, does not stop in front of the ordinary citizen, does not stop in front of schools, so they will not stop in front of all of these things as well. And in fact, they have carried out attacks against research, universities, research centers, but also against common citizens. Now, what is also interesting about the Antitechnology movement is that both these milieus that I have discussed now share a strong component of apocalyptic millenarianism. In other words, they believe that there is some war changing event that is about to happen or has already started, and that they will play a considerable role during this process, and lots of people will die or suffer during this process, and then at the end of this process, there will be a better utopian world. Now, the narrative is completely different. The insurrectionary anarchist milieu believes that we're currently approaching what they call the singularity, which they predict will occur in 2045, which is basically the moment that machine intelligence will surpass human intelligence, which will cause a war between ideologically different groups, and basically a war between those who support machines and those who don't support machines. And so why and on the whereas the radical environmentalist milieu believe that that the war that this I mean, sorry, just a sec. I can see the messages, Aluk, but I can't see you. Anyway, so the radical environmentalist milieu, especially in this case, the Individually Standing Towards the Wild, believe that the ecological collapse is imminent, and they're actually welcoming this event because they will give them a chance to exact revenge on the techno-industrial society and to punish mankind for what they have done to the environment. So they're both milieux not quite afraid of or what of this, imminent apocalypse event. If anything, they welcome this, and they might even want to accelerate this process in order to hasten, the days of the days, after the apocalypse, where they will hopefully, according to them, live in an harmonious world. And again, talking about anti-technology movement, we're experiencing some.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. Great.
oh,
That's
okay,
great, because
okay.
I was just done with the questions, so that was perfect.
Okay, good. No, I'm sorry about that. Like, I'm like at my dad's house and his internet's terrible because there's like a million other people. So I'm really sorry, by the way. I like missed what you were talking about. But
yeah, these have become common incidents during the pandemic. Like online meetings are always enriched by this sort of
Oh yeah, it's radicalizing everyone towards the anti-technology movement.
Yeah, let's not give them ideas, or they might want to use this.
Good marketing idea. Okay, so I'm not sure if you did talk about this like when I was like gone dealing with the internet, but like, so are you aware of like radical anti-technology groups like ITS? I'm pretty sure I can predict the answer, but I'd like to hear more about it. So are you to your knowledge, are they against like the vaccine, especially because it's kind of like a new technology? Like, what are their opinions on it?
Yeah, no, their opinion is awful, and there's also, even though we tend to associate certain conspiracy theories with more right-wing milieus, there's plenty of conspiracy theories within this milieu, within the radical environmentalist milieu and the insurrectionary anarchist milieu as well. Let's not forget that anarchists had already started attacking 5G technologies long before the pandemic. And all these vaccine things, it's just confirming their theories about 5G technology being this bad thing that they believe it is. So they are against it, and especially ITS really it's really probably the technologies that they hate the most are those that allow humans to manipulate nature. So they really express profound distaste for nanotechnologies in particular. So so they do have a problem with the vaccines, of course. And now there have been a few attacks on vaccination centers. There have been a few that I can recall in Italy, in the Netherlands, and also there was an attack against attack against the Robert Koch Institute in Berlin, Germany. And there is some evidence that suggests that it was anarchists who carried out these attacks. Now, those were like low-profile attacks, no casualties, just limited property damage and so on. But still, it shows us, that not only they're against them, they're also ready to take actions against it. Now, again, the evidence that we have so far is quite limited, or at least the evidence that I've seen is quite limited. So if on the one hand, it seems to belong to the anarchist milieu, on the other hand, I can't say if the signature FAI was used. I can't say if the ITS has done something in this past few weeks or months as well. But I can definitely say that they are quite against it, and that we already seen some action, being taken based on the fact that they are quite against it. Yeah.
Well, if anyone is watching this who is against the vaccine, I personally have been vaccinated twice, and I am not a government drone yet to this moment.
Well, I've got mine next week, so I'll be able to update you next week on whether maybe the technological disruption that we just experienced is because
maybe it's my arm. If I put my arm up to the screen, will it just suddenly the static come up? I'm not sure. Exactly. Just so everyone knows, that was very much a joke, but
yeah, of course. Okay. Yeah, no, let's make things clear. No, with disclaimers.
Okay, so we've heard it seems they have a laundry list of problems. These anarchist and environmentalist groups. They have so much hatred towards the world we live in, etc. There's a bunch of complaints, obviously. So what is their ideal world? What's their ideal post-civilization world? Like, what do they envision creating with their kind of movement?
Yes, I mean, it's basically just going, if I mean, what they're fighting against is the techno-industrial society. So once you remove the techno-industrial society with all the, power relationships that characterize it, that are determined by the technologies themselves, you basically will live in this, harmonious and peaceful world. And now, obviously, as it is often the case, groups that believe that one day they will reach this utopian societies, they are not really generous when giving details about what this world should look like, because they themselves have no idea. I mean, you can see that with more traditional, if you want, ideologies as well, such as, for example, communism, where we quite lack a description of what the ideal communist society should look like. So in a way, they promote this this idea that once you've destroyed the techno-industrial society, you will live in a peace and harmonious world. Now, they're not really, again, very specific about what comes after, but then it also this is also because you have many different sub trends within the anarchist milieu. Like it's quite common to hear about eco-anarchists, like anarcho-feminist, anarcho-nihilist, anarcho-syndicalist, anarcho-communist, and obviously all of these different ideological sub-ideologies or ideologies, they will have different answers to this question. And the same with the radical environmentalist milieu. I mean, some believe that we have to just go back to a pre-industrial age. Some believe that we just have to go back and leave like animals, basically. So there's no one single answer for this, but it's partly because they don't really have it, and also because it's even within the same milieu. And this is something that is absolutely common within the anarchist milieu and within the environmentalist milieu. I mean, there are a constellation of very different individuals, groups that have sometimes radical different opinion on certain things. I mean, there is one quote that I love from an anarchist author, anonymous, unfortunately, so I can't share with you, but I can't share the name with you. But basically, this author says, identifying themselves with as an anarchist invites an association with a different array of things that will not have the same meaning to any two person, not even two anarchists. So even when you identify as an anarchist, there will be another anarchist in the same room that probably has quite different approach to and answers to things, and this is just two individuals. Just imagine like a larger milieu with people living and operating in completely different contexts, completely different societies. So again, I'm afraid there's no one single answer to this. It's just this idea of harmonious and peaceful world. Once you have eradicated the source of oppression, exploitation, and so on and so on, we will reach this fantastic world.
Yeah, I guess it is super hard, right? I mean, it would be easy if we could just say, oh, every group is like this, right? I mean, but there's no homogenous ideology, especially.
But then, this is just like peculiarity of these groups. I mean, even like, I mean, you had groups that obviously had more the concrete ideas of what they wanted. Again, for example, the IRA was quite clear when it comes to what they wanted. But other groups, for example, the Red Brigades, they when they had to talk about the kind of societies that they want to implement, they want to create, they were always quite vague and always quite, that didn't really make much sense what they were suggesting. So it's not something that is only peculiar to the ATM. Sorry for interrupting you. I just wanted to make this clarification.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, it is a lot easier to generalize about these kind of terrorist and extremist groups, but you can't, right? I mean, there's so much, different aims, different ways to achieve the goals. Even you said like some people are outright attacking, vaccine distribution centers or what have you. And then, other people are doing other kinds of attacks. So, I mean, it really does vary, obviously. But, I think we've covered like a very wide variety of topics today, and I think pretty in depth too with the anti-technology movement. And then, what we talked about earlier as well. So kind of just one final question. We were just talking about how they obviously have much different views, even among, the environmentalists. But do you think the onset of green technology and similar advancements in like kind of the clean energy movement we've seen as like a pushback against, I guess, climate change, do you think these are kind of going to pull the rug out from under the feet of groups like the REM? Is that going to happen at all?
So just another word on the different positions, just to make another clarification. Even within this milieu, even though within this extremist milieu, it's a very small minority that embraces and accepts, legitimize the use of violence. Just someone who belongs to someone who identifies as an anarchist, or as an radical environmentalist, or as an anti-tech person, doesn't necessarily embrace political violence. Just let me make this clarification. Then, again, since there are so many different positions and approaches, I guess the answer would be different depending on what we're talking about. I mean, if we look at the two groups that I discussed in my paper, I don't think that will actually make much of a difference. If anything, they will hate that, and they will want to destroy it. And this is actually something that comes from it's a direct influence, I think, in my personal opinion, it's a direct influence of Theodor Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who was, if you want, the first anti-tech warrior when he launched his one-man war against the tech-industrial societies in the late 70s. Basically, this is, I guess you can boil it down to the reformist versus revolutionary approach. So on the one hand, they want to destroy these societies, and that's, I guess, what the revolution is about: destroy and build. They don't want to reform them. They're actually quite opposed to those movements that want to those mass movements that are promoting an environment-friendly agenda. They're quite against, the Fridays for Future movement. And they're quite against all of these, what they call leftist groups, that instead of destroying the system are just reforming it, allowing it to survive. So if these technologies, these new green technologies that might, contribute to finding solutions to climate change, will allow the system to survive, then obviously they're against them. Because at the same time, they will still, from the anarchist perspective, they will still empower specifically, like enable the elites to perpetuate, the oppression of the masses, and to establish this totalitarian societies, as they call it. And from the environmentalist perspective, these technologies will still allow the separation between man and nature, which goes against the fundamental notions of the deep ecology philosophy and ideology. So I would say, the most radical fringes would definitely not will not become more moderate because of this technological advancements. If anything, they will think that they're also part of the problem. Then within the same movement, within the very ATM, you might also find people that are actually sort of supporting this sort of developments. Even within the insurrectionary anarchist milieu, there are groups, even radical groups, even groups that do believe in the role of violence, that accept some form of basic technologies. There are also some that accept, for example, solar energy, because they believe that solar energy is actually an example of energy, of technology that does not lead to a widespread exploitation and does not establish certain power dynamics between individuals. But then again, we go back to the original point. I don't think you can have two anarchists in the same room agreeing on this issue. Which is also probably one of the reasons why they tend to stay such small disorganized group. I mean, it's in their natures, in their ideology to avoid any sort of organizations, because it leads to hierarchies and power dynamics, which is something that they want to avoid. So they embrace the leaderless resistance movement, which again allows them to survive even without an ideological cohesion, if you want. So yes, to go back to your question, I don't think the most radical fringes, or at least the two groups that I've looked at, I don't think they will be impressed with this technology. And if anything, if they have a chance, they will probably strike it.
Yeah, I mean, there's even people in the mainstream discourse who argue, oh, these kind of like clean technologies, are they really clean, or are they just governments trying to do kind of PR thing, right? So, I mean, I guess that kind of, even regular people are talking about it, although not to the degree, obviously, that you mentioned that these groups are doing.
I think talking about that, there was actually an attack last week allegedly, I mean, still, investigations are going on, and I think in Munich, where apparently some alleged anarchists carried out an attack against a power plant and against electric grid, and there was a power outage for like several hours in large parts of Munich, and this is something that anarchists have been advocating for the past few years, and I don't think that this will change whether the power plant is green one or is another one. So
yeah, it's still rooted in the kind of like, it just, obviously they're not going to support it regardless, and they're going to just think it's the same kind of oppression under a different name or a different guise. So definitely. So I really appreciate you having come here, taking the time to do this, our little podcast. We're super appreciative, obviously, and it was a super enlightening conversation. I mean,
thank you so much for having me here, and go on. Sorry, I interrupted you again.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm super appreciative you took the time to do that, and I know you're super busy. So that's great, and I hope if anyone is watching that they learned a little bit. And I'm sorry again for the little technological mishaps. I mean, that's the world we live in right now. But anyways, I'm very appreciative, Mauro, and hopefully we can talk again sometime.
Yeah, sure.
It was keep in
touch. Yeah,
it was a super great talk.
And if anyone in the audience wants to reach out, just feel free. You can find me on Twitter. And thank you again. It was a pleasure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for watching. I guess it'll be